Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We're continuing with the Columbia Lore series, and today we are taking a look at the opening campaigns of the Lakeshire War. If you're interested in the build-up to this conflict, the previous two videos in this series cover all of those details at some length. Now, today I don't plan to talk about many of the major encounters in the war. This video more gives an overview of the basics of the campaigns of the war. We won't be talking about any of the major conflicts in the middle of the war at any length, although there will be a video on the Battle of Five Ridges, the last major engagement before the Columbian regulars march into Lakeshire's capital. But first, a quick look at where most things stand. Lakeshire is far to the north. As the name implies, it is in a region with a large number of bodies of water. To the south, Volcanus sits on the banks of the Mississippi River. Not quite halfway between the two, Avangard sits on the shores of a major lake. This lake is called Michigan by the natives and Avendeep by the Columbians. Now, as I mentioned last week, by the time the situation deteriorated to hostilities, Volcanus already had militia forces in encampment around Avangard. That put a considerable buffer of space between them and Palmyra, the Lakeshire capital. With a large body of water to their east and a border with the Sana people to the north, there were really only two ways that Lakeshire could spread out to establish their own defensive perimeter. At least without potentially offending the League of the Sana and drawing all of Columbia into another war with the native people of the continent, something which they were not willing to do. So the Council of Lakeshire settled on a two-pronged approach. The first prong was to petition the government in Hancock along the east coast of the continent to intervene in the situation and potentially find some kind of negotiated peace. The second prong was to deploy the Lakeshire militia in a defensive perimeter, using many of the smaller bodies of water as a kind of defensive line, with the militia proper concentrated in the largest passages between bodies of water, repairing and re-establishing a number of forts that had been used during the Sana Wars about 100 years before. However, Palmyra was not the only place that was petitioning Hancock. Volcanus also wanted to bring in the Columbian government on their side. Their argument, that Lakeshire was wielding influence not only over its own territory but a number of adjacent counties, and that they were beginning to use the Knights of the Stone Circle, which Volcanus characterized as part of their military, to intervene in the affairs of counties even further outside their own borders, was a cause for concern to the government of Columbia as a whole. A great deal of negotiation went on during the spring and early summer of 860. Ultimately, the government in Hancock sided with Volcanus. They demanded that Lakeshire make a number of pretty significant concessions in order to re-establish peace inside the borders of Columbia, not the least of which was the complete disbandment of the Knights of the Stone Circle, a step that the Lakeshire government insisted they were not capable of taking, as the Stone Circle represented a private organization. The Columbian government chose to interpret this as a sign that Volcanus was correct, and the Knights of the Stone Circle were an unaccountable organization that was at least tacitly approved by the government of Lakeshire in Palmyra. At that point, Lakeshire could see the writing on the wall, and they chose to go on the offensive, hoping they could make a break for Volcanus, seize the city, and force some kind of peace at sword point. The offensive of 860 was led by the cavalry general James Jackson. Not only was Jackson a respected member of the Lakeshire militia, he was also a knighted druid and a member of Moraine Henge's founding circle, a group of the 7 most powerful knights in the order. In conjunction with General George Cooper, also of the Lakeshire militia but not a member of the Stone Circle, Jackson was able to throw the Lakeshire militia back south. Cooper drove an entire division of Volcanus militia across the river, while Jackson successfully split another division in half, leaving 2 regiments exposed to the elements as the winter of 860 fell. Except for the regiment remaining in Avangard, most of the Volcanus militia was facing a very grim season, at least until Columbian regulars began to come up and reinforce their positions. Once the prospect of serious campaigning was cut off by snowfall, Columbia began to reinforce its positions in earnest, building up new bodies of troops and preparing for a serious push to dislodge General Jackson and General Cooper in the following spring. Columbia also began recruitment drives so that they could build up new divisions and also staff the long frontier against the Sana to the north and Tetzlan to the south. Because it's not like they could just throw their entire army into the fray without facing any consequences from surrounding powers. For those wondering, Roy Harper joined the Columbian regulars in 861. But as a newly enlisted private, he wouldn't have a very large role to play in much of what was to come. By early summer of 861, General Scott Taylor Walters took command of the Columbian regulars in the theater of Lakeshire operations. General Walters was well aware of the fact that he had superior numbers, superior equipment, and time was in his favor. So rather than planning a grandiose move where he cut off some part of Jackson or Cooper's armies, he gradually began to build an encirclement in conjunction with parts of the Columbian Navy. Lakeshire was largely landlocked. Yes, they did have a sizable border along a major lake, but they didn't really maintain warships. So, for much of 861, the Columbian Navy that operated in Lake Avendeep spent its time ferrying troops and supplies across the northern part of the lake and establishing a beachhead on a peninsula just north of Palmyra. Eventually, by 862, there was a full army division there, menacing Palmyra's northern flank and forcing them to draw valuable troops away from the front lines to the south. There wasn't ever any major fighting along this front, just skirmishing and a lot of very tense watching of the other side. But ultimately it had the desired effect. It kept Lakeshire from concentrating its forces. Walters arranged for similar steps to be taken along the northwestern border. A new army division made of fresh recruits, with a handful of seasoned regiments thrown in to keep things in order, was formed around several companies from the Army Corps of Wizardry, who then animated sections of the forest and had them throw themselves across the river, effectively creating an instantaneous breachhead. At the same time, Walters funneled fresh troops in through Avangard. Over the next 2 years, a series of short but brutal battles, followed by long campaigns of positioning, resulted in Walters forcing Cooper and most of the Lakeshire militia back inside the ring of defensive works they initially set up. By late 862, Palmyra was only 48 miles away from the nearest front. Their best commander, General James Jackson, got caught outside enemy lines. He attempted to use one of his crack cavalry regiments on a flanking maneuver designed to cut off Columbia's Northwestern Army Corps. However, the Northwestern Corps was able to join up with reinforcements from the peninsula, and Jackson's maneuver was foiled. When winter came again, Jackson would ultimately be forced to shelter in place, and he would never really be relevant to the defense of Palmyra again. By the beginning of 863, Palmyra could see the writing on the wall. The Columbian regulars were only growing stronger, and Walters was clearly willing to take his time to grind them down to a pulp. And so the Palmyra Council turned to Martin Southwick and Hezekiah Oldfathers, the master and assistant master of the Knights of the Stone Circle, and they asked them to formally take a hand in defense of their homeland. The question was hotly debated by the master, assistant master, and remaining members of the Founders Circle, but ultimately, they agreed. This led to the forming of Lakeshire's 1st Druidic Division, and the establishment of a series of very powerful arcane defenses along a series of 5 ridges just outside of Palmyra. Lakeshire redeployed its militia forces in order to funnel Walter's troops towards these ridges as they marched north, with the hope that a decisive defeat on the 5 ridges would be enough that Columbia would consider the price of completely destroying Lakeshire to be not worth paying. And so things stood in the spring of 863, when Major General Walters kicked off the Palmyra campaign and began the last march north. But we'll talk more about what came of that next week. In the meantime, let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.